COVID-19 update, vaccine safety. So I'm trying to provide data so that you can answer your own questions. But before we do, I want to talk about who I am so you have an idea about why I might be qualified to talk about this. So I'm Tom Sult. I'm a medical doctor. I'm board certified in family medicine. I'm also board certified in integrative medicine. And I practice functional medicine, which is, I'm also on the faculty with the Institute for Functional Medicine, although I do not speak for the Institute for Functional Medicine. I'm speaking on my own behalf. And functional medicine is a kind of science-based, holistic medicine. Many of my patients haven't done well with the standard medical model. They're highly sensitive to medicines. They have lots of side effects, whatever it is. And they've become very skeptical about medicine in general and procedures, et cetera. Many come to me with lots of ideas and worries and concerns and are interested in my opinion. Many are worried about COVID-19. They're also worried about the vaccine. And this is my response. So just so you know who I am and where I stand, I'm vaccinated. My adult children are vaccinated and their families are vaccinated. And my read of the data is that the wild infection, in other words, COVID-19, is dramatically more dangerous than the vaccine. That the vaccine is very effective. The vaccine is safe. That is not to say that there are no issues caused by the vaccine. We will explore some of that. And we're going to go over a lot of data. This is going to be a long video, unfortunately, but I think worth looking at. I want you to know that I have reviewed many alternative ideas published on Substack and similar sites, and I've reviewed the ideas of Dr. Robert Malone and his colleagues. And I have not found any of those ideas as compelling as the peer-reviewed and published science, which is what we're going to go through today. So the first thing is, 99% of people survive COVID-19. Well, okay. Well, another way of saying that is 1% die. So there are 330 million people in the United States. If 1% die, that's 3 million people. And at this point in the pandemic, because we've learned a lot about COVID-19 and we have some treatment options, whether they're monoclonal antibodies or some of the medications that are currently coming out, in a well-equipped and well-staffed hospital ICU, the death rate is around 20% for COVID-19. And because mostly the elderly and people with lots of comorbidities are being ICU admitted. So if that's the case, that suggests that about 15 million people, because if 20% are dying, what's the other 80%? It's 15 million people who require ICU admission. Well, even if I'm off in my math by 15 times, there are only 1 million ICUs in the United States. And the question is that becoming a real issue? Well, in September of this year, the AP, Associated Press, reported that in Idaho, hospitals are beginning to have to ration care because they're being overrun by COVID-19. And other states are following suit. In fact, apparently the governor of Hawaii has signed an order releasing hospitals and healthcare workers from liability in the event of the requirement for healthcare rationing. And more locally, I'm in central Minnesota, and the large hospital near me is Rice Hospital in Wilmer. There are no more ICU beds. There is not an ICU bed in central Minnesota. And of interest, the local infectious disease doctor tells us that there are very few breakthrough cases. So a breakthrough case is a case of COVID-19 in somebody who has been vaccinated. There are very few cases that need hospitalization. So the next issue becomes, but it's just another case of the flu. Well, this is comparing death rates of the flu versus COVID-19. And what we see here is the flu, even in the elderly over 65, the flu never gets above 1% death rate. Look at COVID-19 in the very young, 0 to 4 years of age, the death rate is 1.9%. And then it falls down to kind of flu levels until you get out past 39. At 40, it's almost 1%. So your risk of dying from COVID-19 if you're 40 is about the same of dying from the flu if you're 65 or older. And then it jumps dramatically, as you can see. So it's not just another flu. Is there excess mortality in those who get the vaccine? In other words, is the vaccine killing people? So this is a look at mortality. I realize this is a busy slide here. See if I can point to things without it switching the slide. So this is 7 integrated health organizations in the United States from December 14th of 2020 through July 31st, 2021. What I want you to do is look at this number here, 0.41. If this number or any of these numbers outside of the parentheses are below 1, it means you're less likely to die from the vaccine than other people. So what we're doing in this study is we're looking at non-COVID deaths. So non-COVID deaths of people and comparing that to people who've neither had COVID-19 or vaccination, right? So they haven't died from COVID-19, they die from something else in the general population, and comparing that to people who did not die from COVID-19, who got the vaccine. So it's a pretty good apples to apples kind of comparison. If that number is less than 1, it means that you didn't have excess death rate by getting the vaccine. If that number is greater than 1, then it does. So we're going to look through here. None of these numbers, outside of the parentheses, none of these numbers. So for every age group and every ethnicity, all of these numbers are less than 1. For a second vaccine, all the way through less than 1. When we look at the Moderna vaccine, all of them are less than 1. The second dose of Moderna, all less than 1. When we look at the Janssen, all less than 1. Now, then there's these intervals, this parenthetical 0.38 to 0.44. That means that this 0.41 number, that's our best guess at what the number is, but there's a 95% chance that it lives within these numbers. 95% chance. So we believe it's that number, but it could be anywhere in here. And it's less likely to be at the two extremes. It's more likely to be closer to this number, right? Wherever my marker went, this number right here. So I want to call your attention to 2 areas. This is age 12 to 17. So less than 1 and less than 1. And because they hadn't given these vaccines to people of this age group yet, there's no data. But the intervals, 0.38 to 1.90 and 0.33 to 1.67. First of all, I want to point out that this is a very large interval. And this is a very large interval. That typically we see large intervals when we have smaller data sets. A smaller data set means we can be less confident. So our best belief is that it's less than 1 and even further less than 1 with a second vaccine. But because this interval spans 1, goes greater than 1, we can't say for sure. We just don't know by this study, okay? But for every other category, every other age group, every other ethnicity, there is no measurable, there's no ability to say that there is excess morbidity or, well, in this case, mortality from getting the vaccine. So are there excess side effects from the vaccine? Well, this is a large study that was done in the New England Journal of Medicine, one of the most prestigious medical journals in the world. And this is comparing base rate in the population to whether or not you got the vaccine or the wild infection COVID-19. So here, as an example, we see acute kidney injury right here. Acute kidney injury. And in the blue is the vaccine, and the yellow is, or orange, or whatever color that is the wild infection, COVID-19. And it's comparing a group of 100,000 people. So if you look at 100,000 people and there's a base rate. So in the case of acute kidney injury, it's less than 40, but just to say 40 people in the population per 100,000 will get kidney injury, whether they're vaccinated or whether they've had COVID-19 or not. It just happens, right? Sometimes people get sick. Well, if you've been vaccinated, it'll be 5 less. So instead of 40, there'll be 35. And if you have COVID-19, instead of 40, there'll be 165. Now, at what point are these numbers significant? In other words, is a change of 5 per 100,000 significant? I would argue probably not. I don't think the vaccine is protecting people from injury. I think that's just part of the statistical wobble. And the same thing goes for appendicitis. Is 5 in one group and 4 in the other group statistically significant? And is that really different from the base rate? Probably not. What about arrhythmia? -6 in the vaccine group. Does that mean that the vaccine is protecting people from arrhythmia? Yeah, probably not. But is 166 extra cases of arrhythmia found in the people with COVID-19? Is that significant? Yeah, it probably is. What about deep vein thrombosis? -1 with the vaccine, plus 43. Well, -1 probably isn't significant. So the vaccine isn't protecting us from getting fewer vein clots than just a general population, but the wild infection probably is increasing it. Herpes zoster, this is an interesting one. +16 for the vaccine and -9 for the wild infection. Now, I don't know. Is the vaccine causing excess? Is 16 per 100,000 real? Maybe. I think -9 per 100,000 probably isn't real. And the other thing is when you're sick with something and you get an ache over here on your side, do you notice that it's herpes zoster, or do you just think it's the COVID-19? So does it get reported as often? Then we go on to intracranial hemorrhage, 8 excess in the infection, -3 in the vaccine. Significant? Maybe. Lymphadenopathy, that's swollen lymph nodes. Well, there's a lot of ways to look at this. One is when you're sick with the infection, you're so sick you don't really care about or think about your swollen lymph nodes. The other way of thinking about it is maybe that there is excess lymph node swelling with the vaccine, and that's because it's producing a robust immune response, which is what we want. Heart attack, myocardial infarction, 25 extra in the COVID-19 group, 1 extra in the vaccine group. Is 1 out of 100,000, is that statistically significant, or is that just part of the statistical wobble, depending on which group you look at? Same thing with myocarditis, same thing with epicarditis, and then pulmonary embolism. Lots extra with pulmonary embolism. So let's take a look at the myocarditis because there's been a lot of news about that. So the overall population-based incidence of myocarditis is between 10 and 20 cases per 100,000. There was a study done in Finnish children, and boys age 15 had an incidence of about 14 per 100,000. So that's consistent. That's in between that 10 and 20. But if you think about one group of 100,000 versus the next group of 100,000, that number is going to wobble, between that 10 and 20 cases. So the base rate is something like 14. So that's a base rate of 0.014% of people will get myocarditis, whether they get sick or not. They only get myocarditis not because of COVID-19 or because of vaccine. With the vaccination, there's maybe 0.017%, so 0.003% more. And then with infection, 0.025%, so a little bit more again. So the question becomes, are these tiny percentage changes, are these statistically significant? And I don't think we know the answer to that yet, but I think that this points to a really important issue, and that is that our surveillance systems are so sensitive that people are talking about even these tiny percentage differences. All right. If children are at decreased risk of severe illness from SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus that causes COVID-19, then how does this decreased benefit weigh against the risk of vaccination? Well, first of all, I think we just showed that the risk of vaccination is tiny. And then, so should young people be vaccinated? Well, let's take a look. So COVID-19 attack rates by vaccination status and age. So this is data from the state of Virginia. And they had very high rates of vaccination among Virginians greater than 65 years of age, and lower rates of people who were younger. So 83% of those greater than 65 have been vaccinated as of January or so, and compared to only 18% of less than 18. And there's a change in the trend in hospitalization. It looks like this. So we see these are the age groups. So these yellow numbers here, these are the percent of people in these age groups being hospitalized in January. So I misspoke a moment ago. January is at the beginning and August at the end. So you can see very few young people being hospitalized at the beginning of the pandemic, whereas the elderly percentage is dropping precipitously, right? Yeah, but that means that that percentage is being taken up by all these other people, and we're seeing more young people being hospitalized. And let's take a look at the attack rate. So the attack rate, the blue is unimmunized. So again, if you had a group of 100,000 people and the virus was spreading through that group, in other words, people were coughing and getting sick and so on, we can see that if you're vaccinated, the rate is quite low, whereas the sickness rate is quite high if you're unvaccinated. So let's take a look at 10 to 19-year-olds. If you're unvaccinated, out of that 100,000 people, about 9,900, nearly 10,000, or about 10% of that 100,000 people is going to get sick. It's 3,600 if you've been vaccinated. Looking down here at 60-year-olds, 25,000 people are going, out of that 100,000, are going to get sick. So that's 25%, roughly. 1,300 are going to get sick if they've been vaccinated. So the vaccine is dramatically lowering the risk of getting illness. But this also tells us, just because you're vaccinated doesn't mean you won't get sick. Other data suggests, though, that you're about 11 times less likely to get severe COVID if you've been vaccinated. So you're less likely to get it, and you're less likely to get severe COVID, but it doesn't eliminate it entirely. So then we have to think about long haul COVID, and it appears to be a disease of the young. Here we see in Nature Medicine a report that about 52% of teens and young adults 16 to 30 are experiencing long COVID symptoms. The UK Office of National Statistics reports that about 13% of children 2 to 11 and about 14% of kids 12 to 16 experience long COVID. And these are cases of kids who don't have severe COVID and have no or minimal comorbidities. Then there's the concern about brain shrinkage. So there's a ongoing study in the United Kingdom called the Biobank study, and they just happened to be doing a lot of brain imaging before the pandemic hit. And they called a bunch of people back in to rescan them. And what they found is that there is a significant shrinkage of very specific parts of the brain, including parts of the brain that are involved in executive function, judgment, and impulse control, and things like that. It was also seen that people who had COVID-19 severe enough to be hospitalized appeared to have worse shrinking, although the worsening was not statistically significant. There's also younger people are having strokes. So young people without traditional risk factors for stroke, so they don't have vascular disease, they don't have high blood pressure, they don't have diabetes, they don't smoke, and yet they're getting strokes. And even people who have infections with SARS-CoV-2, but not the disease COVID-19, in other words, asymptomatic infections, these people are at higher risk of getting stroke as well. So in summary, it really looks like the vaccines work, and they work pretty darn well. Are they perfect? Nope, they're not, but they work very well. There's a rising number of young people getting hospitalized with COVID. There are long-term consequences to the wild infection that do not appear to be associated with the vaccine. The most concerning risk factor is this myocarditis thing, which there may be as many as 3 extra cases per 100,000 in the vaccinated group, but there are at least 11 extra cases with the wild infection. So, do the vaccines actually decrease the risk of breakthrough infection? So the headline is fully vaccinated get infected. And they do. They can. And we saw this slide already. And what we see is that your risk of getting infected is dramatically lower with vaccination than without. No vaccine is perfect, and this one certainly isn't perfect. Here's another way of thinking about it. This is from what's being called the Israeli data, because it's from Israel. And what we see in the light blue lines are people over 70 years of age. On the dark blue vertical lines are people under the age of 50. And what we know is that by February of 2021, that people greater than 70 years of age were about 84% of them were vaccinated, whereas only 10% less than 50. In the beginning of the pandemic, way back here in October, we see this black line. This black line is the ratio of people needing mechanical ventilation, being on a ventilator in an ICU, the ratio between people greater than 70 versus less than 50. And we see it's wobbles up and down, but it's more or less flattish to maybe trending upwards until right here. This is the first dose of vaccination, and it starts to fall. And then because of this surge of COVID, they instituted stay-at-home order, and then shortly thereafter, they were able to roll out the second vaccine. And what we see is a drop after the first vaccine and a continued drop after the second vaccine, suggesting that the vaccine is significantly protective of severe COVID-19 requiring mechanical ventilation. Another look at the Israeli data, we see what we call Model 1, which was previously infected individuals versus vaccinated individuals matched for the time that they got sick. In other words, people got the vaccine around the same time that the people who got COVID-19 got COVID-19. There were 16,200 people in each arm of this study. 257 vaccinated people had breakthrough infection. And there was reinfection in 0.12%. But remember, these are people who survived COVID-19. A certain percentage of these people died. But if you survive COVID-19, then you have actually it appears, better immunity than the vaccine. So symptomatic infections, there was 1.18% of these people had symptomatic infections, and 8 or 0.05% had symptomatic reinfection. So, again, wild type infection is better, but at what cost? A significant fraction of these people die when they get COVID-19, and a significant fraction get long COVID or other problems that we've already discussed. So here's Model 2. This is previously infected versus vaccination, not matched for the time. In other words, you could have been vaccinated anytime during the pandemic or gotten COVID-19 anytime during the pandemic. But if you got the infection, you were not vaccinated. So this is a larger group of people, 46,000 people in each arm. There were 64 breakthrough infections, meaning infections in people who were vaccinated. There were 108 reinfections. So again, the natural immunity is stronger But again, at what cost? Because a certain percentage of the people who got COVID-19 didn't survive, and some of them that did survive got long COVID and other complications. And then the third model is previously infected versus people who were vaccinated and had breakthrough. So they had both. They either had previous infection and were vaccinated after, or vice versa. So 14,000 people in each arm. And it turns out here that there is a benefit, as you can see, to having both the vaccine and the prior infection. So recently, a friend of mine had a breakthrough infection. He was vaccinated and then he got sick. And I said, well, good. That probably is good for you because you had a mild case of COVID-19 after you were infected, and it probably improved your immune status. So what does this appear? If we consider that the attack rate from the Virginia data that we looked at earlier in unvaccinated people is around 20% between 60 and 69-year-olds. So that ranges from 2.27% in the young up to 24.29% in the elderly, right? But I just chose 20% because I'm in that 60 to 69 category, I guess. So the breakthrough rate, in other words, what's the probability you're going to get COVID-19 if you've been vaccinated? Well, it's 2%. What's the likelihood of getting COVID a second time if you've already had it? Well, it's 0.15%. So it appears that vaccines definitely reduce, vaccines don't, that's a misprint. Vaccines reduce getting COVID-19 significantly. So natural immunity can reduce infection, but at what cost? You're 11 times more likely to get severe COVID, and you're at risk for long COVID, and so on. So breakthrough versus reinfection rates are low in both groups, all three groups really. Natural immunity, it does appear to be better, but breakthrough rates with the vaccine are very low. And combining an infection and a vaccination is better than either one alone. But again, at what risk? Even if natural immunity is better, a percentage are going to die, a percentage are going to have long COVID, et cetera. So let's take a look at vaccine versus non-vaccine hospitalization rates. So this is cumulative hospitalizations over the pandemic. And what we see is very low hospitalization rates in the vaccinated and higher rates in the unvaccinated. Now, this is cumulative. So let's look at weekly hospitalizations. So this is overall weekly hospitalizations. And again, we see the same trend. Higher rates of hospitalization among the unvaccinated. It doesn't mean that vaccinated people are never hospitalized. Of course they are. And of course they do get breakthrough COVID-19, but it's less likely. Let's break this down by age. Here's 18 to 49. Again, the blue is unvaccinated. The green is vaccinated. Much higher hospitalization rates in the unvaccinated. Same thing by age. This is 59 to 65. Sorry, my graph slid above the numbers. But the same trend. And here's greater than 65. Same trend. Now, why do we care about this hospitalization rate? Well, this study in the Journal of the American Medical Association of hospitalized people, about 29% will go to the ICU. 13.5% will die. 3% will be transferred to hospice. In-hospital mortality increases with age. There's about a 1.4% chance of dying in the hospital if you're less than 30. And if you're over 80, it's about 26%. So vaccines reduce hospitalization. Vaccines reduce breakthrough infections or reinfection rate, but to a lesser extent than the wild type. And again, at what cost? Long COVID, brain shrinkage, mortality. So it seems that the vaccines increase the probability of more aggressive variants. Is this true? Should we just immunize select subpopulations? Will the virus become more deadly due to the vaccines? Well, one of the ideas behind this is this idea of immunological escape or immune escape and increased virulence. The idea is similar to antibiotic resistance. So, antibiotics treat bacteria, but some bacteria can make things that make them immune to the antibiotic. As an example, some bacteria can make penicillinase, which renders the bacteria immune essentially to penicillin. And what we see in that case is that the penicillinase producing strain will become the dominant strain. And pretty soon, all of the bacteria that survive can make penicillin, and penicillin becomes a useless tool against those bacteria. So, do we see this kind of thing happening with the viruses? Do viruses that are not killed off by your immune system have a survival mechanism that leads to vaccine resistance and more virulent strains of the virus? Well, one of the mRNA vaccines was found to induce very high levels of both binding and neutralizing antibodies in adults, and time and dose dependent trends were similar to responses in young adults. So, in other words, the elderly get a similar immune response as young people. And the response after the second dose was even better. So, in other words, after you've had 2 doses of the immunization, you have protection similar to the wild infection in terms of antibody production. We saw earlier that it's more than just antibody production, because the wild infection does give better immunization or better protection, but nonetheless, the vaccine gives very good protection. And then the question becomes, is the vaccine less effective against variants of concern, or VOCs, variants of concern? So the original COVID-19 is called alpha, and then there's beta, and this is a study on beta. And of course, now we're talking about Delta variant. So there were lower antibody titers against the beta variant. However, no one in the vaccinated group went on to get severe disease from beta infection. So this suggests that either the lower titers of the antibodies weren't significant, or there's other parts of the immune system that are helping, as well as antibody production, like T cell production and so on. And then, is the COVID-19 vaccine leaky? So there are a number of studies that looked at this idea of leakiness in a number of different ways, and there are 5 of them on this site, on this slide. And the bottom line from these studies is that the COVID-19, certainly there are some people shedding virus, but it's a low percentage. In this slide, every time you change computers, slides get a little goofy, but this is 2 specific studies, one in Ontario, Canada, where they found that all 3 of the currently available vaccines were effective and gave good protection, even after just 1 dose, to the 4 variants of concern in their population. And 2 doses was likely to give even better protection. And then this study on the Delta variant specifically, there was only modest difference in vaccine effectiveness between the Alpha and the Delta variant. So it really doesn't appear that the COVID-19 vaccine can meet the definition of leakiness. But let's assume for a minute that it does. Let's just assume for a minute that the COVID vaccine is leaky, even though the data supports the idea that it is not. Okay? There's a disease called Meckel's disease. Meckel's disease is actually a disease of chickens with a 90% mortality. So it's far more dangerous than COVID-19. It's far more dangerous than even Ebola. And the vaccine is considered very leaky. Yet, it reduced illness by 99%. So let's dive into this study a little bit. So here's from the abstract from the research paper. Vaccines are leaky because they block symptoms, but do not prevent infection or onward transmission. Leakiness may increase vaccines coverage required to prevent disease spread and can promote evolution of increased pathogen virulence. At least that's the theory. But despite leakiness, they may reduce pathogen load, affecting disease transmission dynamics. Meckel's disease in chickens shows that vaccines with leaky vaccine substantially reduce viral load in both vaccinated individuals and unvaccinated contact individuals they infect. Contact birds, in other words, a vaccinated bird and then a contact bird to the vaccinated bird, are less likely to get sick or die and show less severe symptoms. Contact birds shed less infectious viruses themselves. These results highlight that even partially vaccination or leaky vaccination can have unforeseen positive consequences in controlling the spread of symptoms and disease. So in this instance, even a leaky vaccine was beneficial. So are vaccine boosters necessary? And if so, for everyone? So again, back to the Israeli data. We keep using this because it's the best data set we have worldwide. Comparing SARS-CoV-2 is the name of the virus that causes COVID-19 illness. So comparing natural immunity versus vaccine immunity, reinfection versus breakthrough infection, evidence of waning natural immunity and vaccine immunity has been demonstrated. So in both natural immunity and in vaccinated immunity, immune robustness is waning over time. And here in Nature News, 6 months of COVID vaccines, what 1.7 billion doses has taught us. And they note that immunity is waning. Washington State experience, we know that there were 41,000 vaccine breakthrough cases, but less than 1% of them ended up dying from COVID-19. Only 9% were hospitalized. So even though there were a lot of cases, there were few hospitalizations. So in summary, breakthroughs are happening. There's evidence that none of this is driving more virulent strains because the vaccines that are currently available are still treating the current variants of concern. And the vaccine and natural immunity both wane. And it's more likely for you to get COVID-19 after your vaccine is about 6 months old. However, severe COVID-19 is still not common even at 6 months. But probably at about 6 months is when it's time to be thinking about re-immunizing. So why have 30 million people skipped their second dose? If this vaccine is so great, why have 30 million people skipped their second dose? Well, it's actually really common for people to miss a second shot. Shingles shot requires 2 shots, and about 26% of people forget their second shot. The CDC estimates that about 8% have missed their second COVID shot. Reasons, some people are fearful of increased side effects with the second shot, scheduling issues. Some people even say, it's hard to remember to come back in a month, 21 to 28 days. But the truth is, I was unable to find any data that suggested 30 million people. It's more like 15 million at most that haven't gotten their second shot. So that's the presentation today. I hope this data is helpful. If you have questions, please leave them in the comments. We always go through the comments and try to help people figure out what's going on. All right. Thank you very much. Have a great day. I hope that you stay safe.